design, this should continue through the blue line into the post-intervention period. But we don't see that. We actually see a substantial jump of what we estimate is 24.7% after that. And this continues throughout the study period. When we compare other states that don't have standard ground laws, we don't see a comparable jump in that homicide rate afterwards, which gives us a stronger indication, perhaps, that this is something to do with Florida specifically. Earlier this year, we published a much larger review of all studies that had examined the effect of standard ground laws or laws that expanded civilian rights to use deadly force in self-defense. And we found that there were quite a large number of studies now that looked at this. The graph on the right here summarizes those studies in the form of a forest plot. And we found that there were largely two different types of studies: those that looked at US-wide rates of homicide or other types of crime, and those in panel B here that looked specifically at state-specific rates of homicide or crime. And those were largely studies done by ourselves. And the key thing to notice here is that there aren't any studies that really predict effects that standard ground laws have a protective effect on harm or on violence. And we'd expect to see those align on this side on the left-hand side of the graph if we did. But these tend to suggest that there's an association between increased rates of violence in different types of outcomes. But in the US-wide studies at the top, these tend to be more muted effects between, say, 1 and 10% generally. But what we noticed from the single state analyses was that analyses specifically of Florida tended to estimate these enormous effects, upward of 25%. And one thing that we've been concerned about, and the larger US-wide studies don't allow us to do, is to disentangle whether or not Florida is some form of outlier that is distorting effects when analysed at a national level. And so this has kind of provided the basis for our most recent analyses. So what we wanted to do is an updated analysis of the association between standard ground laws and homicide and firearm homicide between 2005 and 2018. We specifically wanted to examine some of the questions around whether or not impacts, if there were any, were concentrated in certain population subgroups. And specifically, we wanted to interrogate this idea that whether or not these effects that are represented at the national level are actually generalized across states, or whether they could be concentrated in certain states, and maybe why that might be the case if it is. So our most recent analysis takes on more of a complicated design. We use CDC rates of monthly deaths like we did in the previous analysis. We're looking at a longer study period. In this analysis, we've got multiple intervention states. So we've got 23 intervention states and 18 comparison states. And we used multiple different design approaches to try and look at this, because not one design approach is necessarily optimal for this. We used a few to try and test the sensitivity of our findings in any one approach. So we first use a controlled multiple baseline interrupted time series design, which looks something like what you'd see on the right here, where you have a kind of sequential introduction of the laws, and the control or the comparator is kind of shifting amongst those states that have not enacted the laws as they come in. For this, we used a form of modeling which allowed us to incorporate nonlinear trends, general additive models. And the second type of design we did was very similar to that which we did in the original Florida analysis, by doing a singular interrupted time series across all of the states and then aggregating these in a meta-analytic design. I won't go into this in the rest of the findings, but we also used negative controls to examine outcomes that were not necessarily hypothesized to be impacted by standard ground laws, but could tell us a little bit about whether or not other things might be impacting or biasing our estimates. So in this slide, it just gives you an impression of the distribution or the enactment of laws over time. And we've got Florida at the top here, which was the early adopter of this law, and then others following soon after, down to others like North Carolina most recently enacting theirs. And these states in the bottom half are those that didn't enact the law during this period of time, and they form our comparison groups. To give you just a few descriptives, and the thing to point out here, which is key really for interpreting our findings and perhaps providing one limitation, is the differences in the baseline rates of homicide between states that enacted standard ground laws and states that didn't. You can see that states that enacted standard ground laws have a far higher rate of homicide, firearm homicide, suicide, and firearms suicide than states that didn't. And this is an issue that could bias our findings in some way. This is a very complicated slide. I won't go into spend too long on it. It's just to give you a sense of what our multiple baseline analysis is actually doing. We have the states in the red here that are intervention states, and the states that are not emboldened in red, which are comparison states. And you can see where we're comparing the pre and post intervention trends and as we were in the previous analysis. To make it easier to interpret our findings from the multiple baseline analysis, we can again turn to using forest plots. And so we estimated using in that analysis that overall there was an 8% increase in monthly homicide rates associated with states enacting standard ground laws, which is very consistent with some of the estimates from other studies that use alternative designs. One of the key things, when we could break, in this design, we could break this down by different population subgroups. And one of the key things we noticed that these effects don't seem to concentrate in any one particular group, which is in some ways, in a kind of health disparities, from a health disparities perspective, this is a good thing. We're not seeing those negative effects potentially concentrate in one subgroup. But this does suggest that these laws are potentially harmful across all population groups, which is another potential concern of those laws. In our meta-analytic design, it allowed us to break down our findings by states. And here what we can see is how the variation in the impacts associated with standard ground laws across states. And you can see there's a considerable variation. Again, as with the studies that we synthesized earlier, these all tend to trend to the right, indicating that they're more often than not associated with increases in violence than any protective effects. But particularly in some states, we see these very big increases. In this one, we estimate Florida 28%, but above 12%, 15%, 16%, and 25% in Missouri here as well. And these tend to be concentrated largely in the southern regions of the US. So what we were concerned with previously was that potentially that the effect we saw in Florida was distorting the effects of analysis done at the national level. Doesn't appear to be the case. Not all states appear to show a significant increase in violence related to standard ground laws, but many do, and those effects are quite large. So, what does this mean in terms of preventable deaths? So from our analysis, we can fairly, in a crude sort of way, get a sense of what this means in total on the numbers. We presented proportional differences in change, but what we estimate from these findings is that in terms of excess monthly death across the US, this amounts to around 62 extra deaths per month in the US associated with the enactment of standard ground laws. And I just want to take this a little bit further. even though these kind of projections are a little bit crude and have some limitations, on the basis of something that has recently come up in the US. And this is very new because this news was only broken last night. This is Congressman Matt Gaetz, who's a fairly controversial figure in US politics, announcing yesterday that he's introduced a bill for a national level stand your ground law. And using our findings, we can kind of extrapolate to project, if we make assumptions about these trends holding for the other states that haven't, which may be questionable, we can extrapolate to all 50 states what this might look like if we were to do what Matt Gaetz is proposing. And you can see these the projections for increases in excess monthly deaths skyrocket. Okay, so just to conclude briefly, we've done a number of separate studies now looking at the potential effects of stand your ground laws. There's lots of limitations to these studies. These are observational designs, and it's difficult to rule out with 100% certainty other competing factors. But what we find in these studies tends to show there's very little evidence to support the idea that these types of laws actually empower people and have a kind of deterrent effect on violence. And this is often the justification used in bills like Matt Gaetz's. We do find growing evidence that enacting these laws is actually associated with harms, sometimes very significant and large effects in certain states, particularly in states in the southern areas of the US. And this might find some support from work that's been done looking at the different cultures around self-defense and violence in the US, like the work of Cohen and Nisbet, which people might be interested in looking at. And just finally, to the question of whether or not these laws exacerbate inequalities in the harm, our findings in the latest analysis tend to show that the harmful effects are cut across most population subgroups. But it's worth noting this is only a very narrow analysis on homicide rates, and there are other types of outcome, non-lethal violence, injury, and other outcomes of criminal justice, the criminal justice process, and instances of injustice where there is more evidence to show that people are treated differently depending on what population subgroups they belong to under these laws. So I'll just conclude there, other than just to acknowledge our funders, the Joyce Foundation in the US, for supporting this, and Oxford University, and to acknowledge my collaborators who worked on various aspects of this project. So thank you. I guess I'll pass on to Abdul.
We may need to unmute some people again, including Steve.
I'm on here, thanks, that's great. So thank you, that's a fascinating presentation, David, and the beginning of a great series of presentations this afternoon. So thank you, Abdul, for bringing up your presentation so swiftly. And without further ado, I'll let you begin, and then we'll follow final presentation after yourself. So please go ahead, Abdul.
Great. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
I've started to lose my voice in the last 2 days, so I'm going to try to minimize the talking as much as I can. So just to give a little bit of an overview of the presentation. So one of the first things I kind of wanted to talk about is just police unionism in America generally, in comparison to what we see in places in the UK, for example, where you have the police federation. So some kind of stark differences. One, police unionism in America really developed in the 60s onwards and really gained momentum through the war on drugs and the crime wave. Similar to the UK, the US had a a big police protest in the early 1900s that led government to start bringing in ways to prevent law enforcement unionism. In the US, police unionism is also obviously sort of the black sheep of the labor movement due to its strange relationship with labor being used to oppress labor riots and etc. Another key difference is that it's extremely decentralized. Police Federation, again, it's not a labor union, but represents over 130,000 officers. In the UK, in the US, there is a large police union, but it doesn't operate the same way. It's primarily hyperlocal and interacts very differently with the layers of American federalism. And because of the heterogeneity with state labor laws. For example, right to work law states is what they're sometimes known as. You have weaker labor laws, makes it difficult to have collective bargaining power and other things. Third, one of the three, and there's many other differences, but I think these are just the three to highlight for context, is that they're very politically active in lobbying, electoral politics, and politics of disruption. The Police Federation isn't supposed to be engaging in or supposed to be politicized in the same way. Obviously, this has become more of an issue in the US in recent years, and we're going to be covering a little bit about that. So why unions? So as we're talking about police violence and police accountability, unions have recently, in the last few years, started to become more of a discussion. They've been found to fight against reforms aimed to improve accountability and transparency, fight against changes in department composition. And by composition, I mean the racial composition of police forces, creating obstacles to discipline accountability, neutralizing politicians, and a history of insulating, advocating for racist practices and racist members. Most recently, I put the NYPD police union chief, which is the largest police union in the US in terms of hyperlocal, and sort of the first time they've really made a federal endorsement, which was not a normal occasion that happened in 2020. And just some small things here and there, some of his highlights. So when we're talking about maybe some of the different ways police unions could impact police practices, accountability, maybe relationships with accountability and violence, and what I wanted to do first is kind of provide an overview of the different dimensions and mechanisms that are sort of there, and then maybe not go into all of them. So obviously you have collective bargaining, you have lobbying, electoral politics, politics of disruption, which are things like strikes, which even though they're outlawed, there are other ways of doing it, like what they call slowdown. So this could be an example of not giving out tickets or not arresting or whatever the case be. Arbitrations, and then just things like retaining, racial composition, things like that. So in terms of the literature, which has really only been emerging in terms of in the last few years when it comes to quantitative work, a lot of the work has been primarily legal and qualitative. And so there has been a lot of recent work finding that there is some sort of relationship with increased police killings, both historically and the granting of bargaining rights. There isn't a discussion of what specifically the mechanism is that could be leading it. Could it be increases in legal protections, contract protections, law enforcement bill of rights? That's what that acronym is, which are state level protections created for officers. Or is it just maybe a cultural phenomenon? So as a first step, what I was trying to sort of get through with this proposed research paper, trying to understand at least one of the mechanisms and seeing if there's a relationship due to qualitative evidence pointing to it. So like I mentioned, the three important papers to really cover is the Dharmapala et al. 2021, which exploited a quasi-experimental design that looked at the relationship of sheriff offices in Florida receiving bargaining rights and an increase in misconduct. Cunningham et al., which found historically the granting of bargaining rights across the country and an increase in police killings. And then Goncalves as well. Although all of them sort of make a mention that it could be police protections, it could be other things. And by police protections, we're going to go a little bit more into that in a second of what that means. So as a first step, I thought it would be an important contribution to sort of develop an index of police protectionism to understand whether these protections within law enforcement Bill of Rights and law enforcement contracts at the local level have any type of quantitative relationship with police violence or abuse outcomes. So the theory here is that police union mechanisms create cultures of impunity and a lack of accountability, which leads to more misconduct over time. And so the specific mechanism we're looking at are these procedural protections. And then we have the hypotheses on the right. So I won't go too much into the data, but here was really the data set that was eventually pulled together was drawing really primarily on these 6: US Census Bureau, Scorecard, the Law Enforcement Management Administrative Survey, FBI UCR, Uniform Crime Reporting, and then two original data sets from an organization called Campaign Zero, which is a union contract data set and a nationwide scorecard. I won't go too much into the landscape of police violence in terms of police killings in the US, but that is the primary dependent variable in the study. A huge limitation with studies on American policing is obviously the difficulty with cross-sectional studies using any sort of uniform dependent variable around police violence. I figure that police killings is one of the ones where we have maybe a little bit more accuracy around, which is why this was used. So in terms of the index construction, and this is the primary independent variable, just the process of how it happened is I took the 845 union contracts that they had. It was coded through a 3-tiered process of different researchers going through a code book and codifying it for 6 different categories, which I'll be discussing in a second, transforming into a binary matrix, doing some exploratory factor analysis to understand sort of weightings. And there was different ways I want to go about doing any type of weighting for the actual index. We could do a simple additive, which is probably the most common, where you just sum up whether it has it or not, or a method that was used for teach union contract protections, which allows for a little bit of accounting for over and underweighting. So it's still not a great way to create an index, but it allows for a little bit more rigor and sensitivity. So, whoops, wrong slide. There we go. So when we're talking about what these procedural protections are, it's sort of grouped within these 6. So disqualifying complaints, restricting investigations, giving officers access to information, limiting oversight and discipline, requiring cities to pay for, so these are indemnification clauses, things like that, and erasing misconduct. So some of these are, they vary in terms of how serious or concerning they are. Purging officer misconduct histories obviously is something of a great concern. But the point of this index is sort of to kind of create, just as a first attempt, let's try to get all the protections into one score and see what it looks like. And obviously, as there's more work done and as the data set expands of contract protections, it'll be more important to start teasing out the different dimensions, especially because a lot of these 6 categories might relate to different types of police outcomes. For example, disqualifying complaints might be more related to the filing of civilian complaints and things like that. So the empirical model, and again, this is not a quasi-experimental design. This is not making any causal assumptions here, but it was a OLS with regional fixed effects and robust standard errors clustered by region. And the reason I use regional fixed effects is one, so it's a smaller data set, 200 cities, and that regional variation from the Holmes and Smith 2014 paper captures, makes the claim that it does a better job capturing variation in historical relationships around race across the country. So in terms of one of the first questions I had of just more of a descriptive, but also out of interest, is whether cities with higher levels of police protections might have higher levels of violent crime. The theory here being that officers might in cities that have higher violent crime might want more protections because it's more violent, it's more dangerous, et cetera. So they might be more willing to, bargain for these types of things. And there was no relationship whatsoever. And, you know, as a next step, not covered in this presentation, but it's also important to do predictions of police protectionism generally and within the index. But this was just something that I think was an important, you know, first step in terms of what we're looking at. Where we're looking at police protections and all police killings. I mean, here is just obviously just a simple plot, but in terms of when we're plotting out the models, the different colors are for the regions, regions being Northwest, Southwest, North, and South. Those are the 4 regions. You can see that there's a little bit of a typo there with the Chandler, Arizona, but you can see that there's a statistically significant positive relationship. Now, in terms of, and this is while controlling for violent crime rate, population of cities, size of department, as well as some of the variables you saw earlier, like the dissimilarity index, which is the, you know, tries to capture some of the racial elements. But again, before I you know, putting any sort of number to the increase, I think it's, since it's not, you know, a quasi-experimental design, I don't want to, you know, give a certain type of, I don't want you walking away with thinking, you know, police protections have led to more police killings. This was really an important step of first introducing police protectionism and making it an important part of estimating police violence moving forward as a first step. So again, some of the key findings, which is violent crime rates are not predictors of the level of police protections. Police protections have a positive significant relationship to police killings of civilians, both individually and with relevant covariates, and that this is true even when we're accounting for segregation levels and other predictors of police violence. Some of the, and before I sort of end it off, it kind of leads to some certain policy implications. One around procedural protections within police departments, within these contract protections, and also around sort of the economic implications of unions that engage in bargaining for these protections over you know, typical fringe benefits and other things that needs to be explored more. Because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of departments that, you know, bargain away, for example, health benefits, like in the case of Chicago, for some of these protections, like erasing misconduct records, which really, you know, protects a fringe part of their department. So there's a lot of interesting policy implications or more explorations that need to happen. But as a next step, it's important to start collecting data temporally of police protections to understand if there is specifically impact of these police protections on increasing police misconduct. But the biggest contribution of this paper, again, is the contribution of the index of police protections, and that it's a relevant dimension that should be introduced and considered in future studies of estimating police violence. But yes, thank you so much for everyone's time. And that is it. I'll pass it over to my other colleagues.
Thanks, Abdul. Can you unmute Thiago, please? There you go.
Yeah, all good. So I'm unmuted, and I think you're seeing my screen now, right?
Right. Yep. So Thiago and I are going to, you know, both provide some comments about our study, and you know, for the audience, you know, thus far you've heard about stand your ground and kind of this emphasis on, you know, kind of do-it-yourself protection in the United States, and then we've from Dave Humphreys, and then from Abdul, you heard about police protectionism, unionism, and the relationship between police violence. And you may think, well, what's the link between those two studies? And I think that's the role that Thiago and I play here, is that we're going to talk about the notion of legal cynicism, and I think that ties everything together. But I just want to return to, and so actually I'm going to return to several points that Dave and Abdul had mentioned, but just to emphasize one point, I wasn't aware that the Congressman Matt Gaetz had proposed this legislation yesterday for a national stand your ground law. But I guess what I'd want the audience to think about is what on earth is going on in the United States that they're going to be talking about a national policy for for people to take matters into their own hands. And what does that say about the role of the police in society? I mean, isn't it the role of the police to protect individuals? Yet you've got a congressman that is saying, we across the United States, we should have this legislation that allows people to take up arms and to protect themselves. And so, why on earth, is there this kind of feeling in the United States that people need to, go access guns to protect themselves? And I should note that, that Congressman Getz is not in the party in power right now, but it's very contentious over there, and he may soon be. So who knows if this legislation, it won't pass tomorrow, but who knows in the next couple of years. Anyway, so Thiago, can I get you to advance a couple slides, probably to the next one, please? So that's kind of my way of introduction in talking about this notion of legal cynicism. And what I mean by legal cynicism, and I've done a lot of work on this over the course of my career, and Thiago and I are doing a lot of work on it right now, but it's this general feeling among neighborhood residents that the law and its agents, such as the police, that they're illegitimate, unresponsive, and ill-equipped to ensure public safety. And so this is a type of perception among neighborhood residents that that we've observed in prior research. And given the importance of trust between the police and the community, really what our research agenda is about is we're trying to understand why trust of the police breaks down and why cynicism of the law develops. And this is a quite consequential thing to think about. And I think Dave Humphreys' presentation touches upon this very well. But what we've shown you right here, and this is kind of related to what Dave was saying about violence in the US. This map right here is from a study I did a while back that shows kind of the geographic distribution of homicide, kind of the growth in homicide in the Chicago area. And what you see kind of in the darker colors is those are the areas where homicide was increasing the most. And as it turns out, those are the areas, kind of the dark gray and the black neighborhoods in Chicago. Those are the areas with the highest levels of legal cynicism in the city of Chicago. That's a map of Chicago there. And so, there's this very strong positive correlation between legal cynicism and homicide. So it's quite consequential to understand, where does cynicism of the law come from? Because ultimately, when there is cynicism, it increases the likelihood that violence may occur. And why might violence occur? Well, Dave already did the hard work for us by basically suggesting that, in a sense, when people are cynical, they're more likely to, take up, to help themselves, rather than rely upon the law to help resolve threatening situations. They are more likely to go find a weapon and do it themselves. And that's why when we did this study back in 2011 in Chicago, that's why we, at least that was our hypothesis for why, we saw escalating homicide rates in certain neighborhoods. There was high levels of legal cynicism, and when people were confronted with the problem, they took care of it themselves. So that's kind of one motivation for our study is trying to think about the causes and consequences of legal cynicism. And then we want to tie it back to what Abdul was talking about with the latter part of his presentation. We want to understand the role of police misconduct and especially police violence and how it may both contribute to cynicism of the law, but in fact, it may also be a product of cynicism of the law. For those in the audience, it may not be a surprise for you to know that that there's roughly 1,000 individuals each year killed by police officers in the United States, and that's been consistent for a number of years. This is something where until recently there's pretty poor data on this, but the Washington Post and the Guardian started figuring out a way to collect data about this. And there's some very good data sets on that allows us to track the number of police killings in the United States. And so it really enables the type of research that we're going to talk about today. I would say that the research is a bit mixed about what happens, what the reactions are to police violence, and whether that, for example, causes people to, for example, stop calling the police. I mean, that's a hypothesis, and there is evidence, including some of my own research, that has found when one of the ways that people react to police violence is that they stop cooperating with the police. They stop calling 911 or 999 to report crimes. So it's so really an underlying motivation of our study is to really kind of tease apart this relationship between police violence and legal cynicism, and we employ some very rich data to do so that I'll talk about in a minute. That allows us to push this agenda forward. That there has been some foundational research done by others. Just kind of going to the bottom bullet point here on our motivation slide. So Abdul talked a little bit about one of the reasons for police violence is maybe related. He was very careful in his language, but maybe related to police unions and the police protections that are found in contracts, in employment contracts. But one of the things that guides our project is thinking about guns. So the nature of policing in the United States is fraught with danger. I mean, there is something like 300, estimates suggest 300 million guns in the United States. And as Dave said, the population of the United States is not much more than that. So we're talking about enough guns to arm almost every single individual in the United States. Now, some people own lots of guns and some people own zero, but estimates suggest that there is a gun in 40% of households in the United States. And so just imagine what that means when a police officer is going to police a neighborhood. I mean, a lot of them, perhaps rightfully so, are going to assume that the people they come into contact in the course of their daily duties, that a lot of them are going to be armed with a weapon. And so one of the things that Thiago and I want to explore in our research is, does that put police officers on edge? And does that then increase the likelihood that a situation or that a confrontation will ultimately end with a use of force? So just to quickly summarize our motivation, so we're interested in legal cynicism, we're interested in police misconduct, and we're interested in guns, and basically the relationship between all those things. They're very complex relationships, and we assume that it's not unidirectional. We assume that there's some reciprocal causation here, which puts a pretty big burden on having the type of data that allows you to kind of tease apart, what's leading to what. Thiago, can you jump to the next slide, please? So I mentioned that there's a big data challenge in doing this type of research to tease out the possible reciprocal causation. What we're going to show you today is data from kind of two different repositories. One's called the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, and the other is called the Citizens Police Data Project. And quickly before I go to the next slide, just want to mention that one of the things we'll talk about, the bottom bullet point there, is called a Tactical Response Report, a TRR. We're not going to throw too many acronyms at you, but that's one that you'll see. And that's in essence, that's a report of use of force that is done by a police officer. And we're going to be talking about Chicago today. But that's a report that they're required to file when they use force, whether justified or not. Thiago, can you go to the next slide? So the first data set, the PhDCN, this is a project that's been going on since 1995, where it's a longitudinal survey across 5 different waves of what back in 1995 were thousands of kids that were growing up in Chicago neighborhoods. And the nature of this project was to understand how do the characteristics of neighborhood environments, how does it ultimately influence youth and adolescent development. But we've decided over time to keep following them up. And actually during the pandemic year, we just completed the 5th wave of the survey just a couple of weeks ago. So, we're going to be presenting to you some very new findings based upon data that was just collected. But the nature of the design was that there's 343 neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, and so first we took a random sample of neighborhoods, making sure that we had a representative mix of neighborhoods. So we had we have predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly Black neighborhoods, predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, as well as neighborhoods that were both deeply impoverished, working class, and middle class. So this is a representative sample of neighborhoods that was underlying our survey data collection, and then a random sample of households within those neighborhoods. And so I emphasize kind of the random and representative nature of the data collection, just to suggest that the people that ultimately were surveyed at 5 different waves in this data collection, these were representative of kids in Chicago neighborhoods starting in 1995, and then we surveyed them in 95, 98, 2001, 2012, and 2021. Another piece of data from this PhDCN project was a community survey. And what we did was we went to each of the 343 neighborhoods in Chicago and surveyed. This was kind of a separate survey of the kids survey. But we sampled 20 or more neighborhood residents just to get a feeling for what are the conditions of the neighborhood, how much disorder, how much crime, people happy to be there, what would they change about their neighborhood? And so it was overall that survey had 9,000 different respondents telling us about their neighborhoods, which allowed us to really understand what was going on in the neighborhoods and how that might influence child and adolescent development. And then finally, we have merged in some criminal history data, going back to birth for a lot of these individuals from the state of Illinois. So, so we can track their criminal records, their arrests, convictions, and their criminal sentences. Thiago, next slide, please. Just quickly, just to give you a sense for this, what was going on in Chicago over the course of the PhDCN study. The red area right there, that's 1995 is when our data collection started, and that's actually when at a macro level in the United States, crime started to decline and declined for almost continuously for about 20 years or so in the United States before flattening out the last few years. But prior to the start of our data collection in 1995 was a period of rising crime in the United States, as well as rising incarceration associated with the war on drugs and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the overall context of our study. We started it right when almost the peak of crime and violence in the United States, but it has since declined quite a bit since then. But because we have 4 different cohorts of individuals, so we have, one cohort were these infants. I mean, obviously we didn't survey the infants in 1995, but we surveyed their parents. But they were 0, right, when crime was at its peak. Versus we also had these individuals that were 15 years old in 1995. So they were coming of age in those neighborhoods with peak levels of violence. And so we can kind of capitalize on the fact that we have 4 different cohorts with different ages, and they're aging through kind of fundamentally different social worlds, because the context of crime and violence and policing had changed in Chicago, over the past 40, 50 years, that, it allows us to do some pretty interesting things about how social context influences behavior. I think I've got one more slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Thiago, but can you advance one more, please? And I mentioned the Citizens Police Data Project. What you have here on this is a screenshot from their website, and I encourage you to go out their website and play with data. But this is this is a charitable organization, a nonprofit that through through Freedom of Information Open Records request, has compiled data on hundreds of thousands of records of police complaints and those TRRs I mentioned of use of force, for the city of Chicago and the Chicago Police Department. So what you can see on your screen here is, going from 1988 to 2018, there was 250,000 allegations of or complaints against the Chicago Police Department. 56,000 of those were complaints for use of force. Not all of them sustained, and certainly not all of them disciplined. Only 7% of those were disciplined. But still, we're talking about a massive treasure trove of data about the reaction of citizens to the police, and as well as indicators of police behavior. And so we use this data to get a sense for not only police activity, but people's likelihood of filing a complaint when they think that, for example, the police have used force in an unjustifiable manner. So Thiago is going to tell you a little bit more about our data, and then obviously show you some of our results.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? All good? Yeah, thanks. All right, so I'm going to present some of the data that Dave was just introducing. So as he just said, we have two sources of data. We have the PhD-CN data, and then we have the Invisible Institute data, starting with the latter. So we basically went to that website that Dave was just talking about, and we collected all the data that was there. The data was essentially about complaints against police officers and about TRRs, which are the records of police use of force. And just to start making sense of the data that we have collected, on the left-hand side of this line here, we have a picture of the time series from 2004 to 2015, just getting a small window here, and we're comparing the TRRs, the number of TRRs by year, and the number of complaints by year. But now I'm filtering the number of complaints. I'm not talking about all the complaints filed against police officers in Chicago. I'm talking about complaints that were sustained and complaints specifically against use of force. When we talk the complaints data, we could go back up to the 1980s, although TRRs, we can only go back up until 2004. That's why that's the time frame that I'm focusing on right here. But specifically for the complaints, we could go even further back, and we will go even further back in some of the analysis that we are conducting. And if we move to the right-hand side of this slide right here, I'm basically plotting on the Chicago map. I'm talking about Chicago neighborhoods. I'm plotting the average TRR, so the average number of records, the number of TRRs in Chicago neighborhoods between 2004 and 2016. We have various maps, so if you're curious, I'm more than happy to show a few others later on, but they all show basically the same story. We can take the average TRRs, we can take the number of TRRs every year, we can talk about the average number of complaints, we can talk about the number of complaints every year, but they all will tell basically the same story. As you can see, so this map, the neighborhoods that have a slightly lighter color have a very, very low number of TRRs recorded. And as the colors go darker, that means an increase in the numbers of recorded TRRs. And as you can see, there is a cluster in the central part of the city, that's downtown Chicago around here. You would expect there to be lots of police use of force in that region simply because there's a lot of people on the streets. It's the central part of the city and so on. But you can see two other clusters. First of all, you can see a cluster on the west side of Chicago, right here. So lots of cases of police use of force in that part of West Chicago. And that part of West Chicago is one of the most socioeconomically disadvantaged parts of the city. And you can also see another cluster in South Chicago here, not as strong as the other one, but definitely stronger than the rest of the city. In South Chicago, that is also a very structurally disadvantaged part of the city. So we can see that there appears to be a spatial association between the concentration of use of force in Chicago, police use of force, and some other characteristics such as such as socioeconomic disadvantage. And part of our motivation here is exactly try to find which of those characteristics are associated with police use of force. And of course, our main goal will be to associate all that with legal cynicism. That is the concept that links it all together, as Dave was just saying. All right, so what are we going to do with all the data? So linking PHDCN data and data on police use of force in Chicago. We're going to conduct, so just to make it very, very clear, these are just preliminary findings. This is an ongoing project. We're still going through most of the analysis. But for now, we're going to present three basic findings that we have managed to find so far. First of all, we are going to start with an ecological analysis. What do I mean by ecological analysis? That just means I'm comparing neighborhoods. I'm not comparing individuals. I'm not talking about people here. I'm talking about neighborhoods. And the first aspect of our research, linking to Dave Humphreys' presentation earlier today, we're going to see the association between police use of force and the proliferation of guns. And basically, we want to assess whether neighborhoods with greater gun access, neighborhoods with a higher number of guns, specifically in households with children, if they actually are more exposed to police use of force. The second analysis that we are going to show you today, again, an ecological analysis. So again, focusing on neighborhoods, comparing neighborhoods, we're going to assess the association between police use of force and legal cynicism. And basically, just like Dave showed the map in the beginning of the presentation, showing the homicide in Chicago from his 2011 paper, we're going to see whether those places are also not only are those places characterized by high levels of legal cynicism, maybe they're also characterized by high levels of police use of force. And finally, we're going to move on to an individual level analysis, again, on the relationship between police use of force and legal cynicism, but now using the PHDCN Wave 5 data, so the data that was collected this year in 2021. And basically what we are going to do is, because we have data on respondents who were kids in the 90s, and we have all their residential history, we're going to link their residential history to levels of police use of force in the neighborhoods. So we have a measure of how many years the respondents have lived in neighborhoods that had different levels of police use of force, and we're going to see whether that is associated with measures of legal cynicism in 2021, so 25 years later. All right, I'm going to present some results now. I'm going to avoid some of the technical terms. So if you have questions about methods and technical bits, I'm more than happy to address them in the Q&A session. First of all, the ecological analysis comparing gun access and police use of force. I'm talking about gun access in 98, the average between 97 and 99. Won't go into details here, but basically what I have here is the estimated probability of gun access in households with children in 78 Chicago neighborhoods. And I'm going to see whether the probability of gun access in 98 predicts police use of force in the 2000s, taking the average for the decade. And I'm going to have three different response variables: the number of registered TRRs, so the number of all complaints filed, and specifically the number of complaints that were sustained, and specifically against use of force. And what we have here is that we do find a positive relationship. For those of you who care about that, these are Poisson regression models with a bunch of control variables that make sense. But focusing on what actually matters to us here is what we can see here is that neighborhoods that have a higher probability of having guns in households with kids also tend to have more TRRs a decade later. They tend to have more complaints against police officers a decade later, and specifically they tend to have more complaints against use of force that were sustained, that were founded a decade later. So there appears to be an association, as we expected, between gun access and police use of force. Just a parenthesis, one of the things that we are interested, we still don't have an analysis ready, is to check the reverse relationship here. As Dave was saying, we believe this to be a reverse causation scenario. So we want to check the opposite relationship as well, but this is still an ongoing project. All right, moving on. Second part, legal cynicism and police use of force. So now to measure legal cynicism, again, remember this is an ecological analysis. So we're using PhDCN data from 1995, not the longitudinal data analysis, but the community data. So the one that surveyed all 342 neighborhoods in Chicago. Almost 10,000 people were surveyed in 95. And then we had questions such as laws are meant to be broken and the police are not able to maintain order on the streets. And then we came up with a measurement model. We developed an IRT model, a multi-level IRT model to measure legal cynicism at the neighborhood level. Not only that, we were also interested in measuring not only the average levels of legal cynicism in each neighborhood in Chicago, we wanted to measure how consensual that was, because maybe there are some neighborhoods that are really, really homogeneous. The average legal cynicism could be high or could be low, but every resident has sort of the same perceptions of the law and the police. And then there's not much variation within the neighborhood. But there might be other neighborhoods that are not that consensual. They're very heterogeneous. So there's a lot of variation within the neighborhood and people have different perceptions of the law and the police. And so we also came up with a measurement strategy to measure the variation of our scales. For those of you who care about that, this is a location scale model. And finally, we have the same measures of police use of force, TRRs, complaints, and complaints against use of force. And when we check the association between that, again, these are autoregressive Poisson regression models. That doesn't really matter. What matters to us here is that on the x-axis, we have legal cynicism. And on the y-axis, we have three different measures of police use of force. And as we increase legal cynicism, so as we move towards the right-hand side on the x-axis, we can see that the expected number of records, the expected number of TRRs, complaints, and complaints against use of force, they're all expected to increase. So neighborhoods characterized by more legal cynicism tend to be neighborhoods also characterized by more records of police use of force, even considering three different measures of police use of force. But that's not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is, as I said, we also measured the variation of legal cynicism within each neighborhood. And this relationship that we're finding between legal cynicism and police use of force was actually not the same for neighborhoods with different levels of consensus, with different levels of homogeneity, of variation of legal cynicism. What do I mean? All right, let's see what I mean. Hang with me here. So let's say we have 5 different types of neighborhoods here. We have the 2 neighborhoods that are completely homogeneous. Every resident of the neighborhood has exactly the same perceptions of the law and the police. And then we have some neighborhoods that are moderately homogeneous, and then we have some that are slightly heterogeneous. And on the other end, we have some neighborhoods that are very heterogeneous. No one agrees with each other. All the residents of the neighborhood, they have different levels. They have varying perceptions of the law and the police. And when we moderate by that, what we can see here is that the effects of legal cynicism and police use of force are actually different. We have 3 plots here. We have complaints on the top left side here. We have complaints against use of force on the top right, and we have TRRs on the bottom left. Let's focus on TRR just because it's easier to visualize, although the message is the same for all the plots. The orange line here are very homogeneous neighborhoods. So these are neighborhoods that everyone has pretty much the same beliefs, the same perceptions of the law and the police. In those neighborhoods, in those extremely homogeneous neighborhoods, extremely consensual neighborhoods, as you increase scores of legal cynicism, the expected number of TRRs or complaints against use of force, they're expected to increase a lot. Okay, so as we expected, that's good. And then we have the blue line here. These are moderately homogeneous neighborhoods. So people still pretty much agree with each other, not as much as the very homogeneous ones, but pretty much they agree with each other. And we can see that as scores of legal cynicism increase, TRRs and complaints against use of force are also expected to increase, but on a slightly weaker rate. And as we increase the heterogeneity of the neighborhoods, we can see that the effects are getting weaker and weaker. When we move to the other side of the equation, when we look at very heterogeneous neighborhoods where people do not agree with each other at all, the variation is massive. We actually have the opposite. We have maybe a null and sometimes even a negative relationship between legal cynicism and police use of force. And what does this tell us? This basically tells us that police use of force is more common in neighborhoods characterized by high levels of legal cynicism, yes, but specifically in neighborhoods where legal cynicism is very homogeneous and where most people have very cynic views of the law and the police. When there is some variation, the expected number of police use of force, expected levels of police use of force tends to decrease slightly. All right, and finally, the last finding that I want to show you. I know our time should be up by now, but very quickly now. Finally, the only individual level analysis that we're doing. So now we're connecting the use of the Invisible Institute data. So police use of force in the 90s, we're connecting that to the most recent wave of the PHDCN that was collected in 2021. So we're measuring the number of years during childhood, thinking of the period from 8 to 20 years old, number of years that our respondents have lived in neighborhoods with different levels of police use of force, with different levels of complaints. For this analysis, I cannot use TRRs. I can only use complaints. That doesn't really matter for us, but just a quick note on that, because we don't have TRRs data in the 90s. But basically what we have here is number of years that each respondent has lived in a neighborhood characterized by low levels of complaints against police officers, moderate levels of complaints, or high levels of complaints. And we're linking that, the number of years that they have been exposed to police use of force, to a measure of legal cynicism in 2021, so 25 years later. And what do we find when we do that analysis? Again, controlling for a bunch of interesting control variables. What we do find is that the longer our respondents have lived in a neighborhood characterized by low exposure to police complaints, pretty much there's no difference in their scores of legal cynicism. It doesn't really matter. The longer respondents have lived in neighborhoods characterized by moderate levels of exposure to police complaints, exposure to police use of force, again, pretty much no difference. It doesn't really, or at least we don't have enough statistical power to claim that there is any distinction here. However, the longer the respondents have lived in a neighborhood characterized by high levels of police use of force, and then we do find a difference, the more we expect them to, the greater their scores of legal cynicism 25 years later. This is the coefficients of regression models for one additional year. So every additional year that they lived in a neighborhood with high levels of exposure to police complaints, we expect an increase greater than 0 in their scores of legal cynicism. So for respondents who have lived for 10 years, 20 years in those neighborhoods, we would expect really high scores of legal cynicism 25 years later. All right, and what do we make of all that? As Dave was saying, legal cynicism is the central bit of our exposition here. Just to emphasize, these are preliminary findings. This is an ongoing project. But basically, what seems to be the case is, first of all, gun proliferation increases risks of danger for police, and therefore probably contributes to police use of force. Police officers tend to use the force more often in neighborhoods where there are more guns, as we would expect. And what we want to find out next is whether the opposite relationship is equally true, whether more police use of force also tends to increase the increased gun proliferation, because people will lose their faith in the ability of legal institutions to protect them. So this is, well, next presentation. Second, legal cynicism and police use of force. As we would expect, legal cynicism is highly associated with police use of force. For all of our measures, this is associated with the number of complaints, specifically number of complaints against use of force and TRRs. But what is more interesting about that is the importance of consensual perceptions about the law and the legal institution. So not only how cynic people are matters to where police officers are going to use the force more often, but how consensual those views are. When a neighborhood is homogeneously consensually cynic of the law and the police, that's the neighborhoods where the police tend to use the force more often. And finally, why does that all matter? Because apparently exposure to police use of force has some long-term impacts on views about the law and the police. People who have been highly exposed to police use of force during their childhood and adolescence, they have some long-term consequences. They develop the more cynic views of the law and the legal institutions. And for all the reasons that Dave mentioned in the first slide, this can have very negative impacts for their relationship with legal authority, for the behavioral aspects, and so on. All right, so I do apologize for running out of time slightly, but that's it. Thank you very much, and more than happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great, thank you. I think everybody hearing me okay, yeah? Great. I think everyone agrees there's 3 excellent papers there, so thank you to our panel members. We have had some questions coming in, so what I'm going to do is just take them in the order that they came to start off with. So the first one to the panel is in relation to the deaths in the US in relation to stand your ground laws. Is there any work which has looked at whether the deaths are weighted towards the suspects or the victims?
No, is the short answer to that. I think the majority of studies that have analysed this have used either police data or CDC mortality data. The mortality data can't really differentiate, and tells you about the basic characteristics of the person who's died. The police data you can using some of the supplementary FBI data, I think, get at this, but I don't think that analysis has been done. I'm not entirely sure. We haven't done that, and not entirely sure that whether the data will allow a very good or a very reliable analysis of that question. So sadly not.
No problem. Thank you. And we have another question regarding the thousands of police killings per annum. My recollection of it shows quite a proportion of victims are white, although the majority are from Black, Asian and minority groups. So I'm just going to, there's a few more questions attached to this one. True, the implications are that police killings are not just racist acts, although they may be. So what's your thoughts on the number of killings and the proportion and what the implications might be for those?
I guess I can weigh in on this. Yeah, so you can go out and access data on, it's pretty fine-grained data on all these killings. I mean, I mentioned the Washington Post and the Guardian data. There's some other ones. Mapping Police Violence is a website. Fatal Encounters is another one, and you can look at the racial distribution of these killings. There's also some information on whether the suspect had a weapon or not. So certainly, when you're talking about 1,000 killings, there's going to be a whole range of circumstances that led to it. And I think part of what we tried to do here today was to talk about some generalities that may contribute to this. Does the kind of the circumstances or the policies of a police department, referring to Abdul's research, does that contribute to an environment where police violence may be more likely? Does the characteristics of the neighborhood where police are engaged in their in their daily activities, does that contribute to the likelihood of police violence? For example, if somebody is patrolling a neighborhood that where they're assuming there's a lot of guns around, does that put them on edge? and make it more likely that they would use violence. So, as to the question of whether, any or what proportion of those 1,000 killings each year are, are a function of racism, that is a huge question in criminology, and whether we're talking about institutional racism in a entire police department, or whether we're talking about the prejudiced behavior of a given police officer. And I would say that that's a very active research field and hotly debated with mixed results. Quite frankly, that's my reading of it. I see Abdul smiling. He's probably thinking about the delicate way I'm trying to say there's mixed results, but it's I will say it's hard to study, and there's because the data requirements to assess institutional racism in policing, are very tough. But this Chicago data that we used can really be leveraged to doing some pretty interesting work on looking at racism in policing. We haven't gotten there with our own research, Thiago and I, but I'm thinking of a study by an economist named Boker Ba, who's doing some pretty interesting work on the question of racism in policing. Abdul, or Thiago, do you want to add anything on this topic?
I mean, the only thing to note, obviously the police killings data is limited in a lot of ways, and it's publicly scraped. And I know there's efforts to make more granular data available, but with the exception of the Fagan and Campbell study that tried to create some sort of standard, I think it was in 2020, around reasonableness of killing, they were able to kind of look a little bit into racial bias and things like that, but it always gets difficult because we're looking at outcome data when we're looking at police killings data. So when we're trying to measure or create a measure of racism, we always need that first point of contact data, right? And the only other thing I would say, just add is and Dave kind of just touched upon it, but having non-fatal police encounters is so critical, and I think that requires a endeavor that looks at hospital records and things like that, and that's just not there yet. But the Chicago data is very promising, so that would be really interesting to look at.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add any comment? No. Okay. Got another next question. In is while the law changed, and I think this refers to stand your ground. Do we know whether people's gun carrying practices did likewise? It's an issue with lots CCW advocacy research too. But given the much debate question about whether US ownership is falling or rising, there's much hype, but rather less evidence. So that really focuses on the known about people's gun carrying practices as the law changed.
You want me to jump in? Is that why you're pointing to me, or are you
on mute?
You can't unmute.
I couldn't unmute. Yeah, I think that question was for me from Peter Squires. Good to meet you, Peter. I have a very well thumbed version of your book somewhere around here. So thanks for that question. Yeah, I think it's one of the key questions, and it extends beyond our analysis in a way to kind of how and what explains these findings, and that's kind of very difficult to get at, I think. I mean, presumed in the logic of or assumed it is, I think, the idea that, well, how did this work? Did it force people to pick up guns, carry them around more regularly, and then those became active in any disputes that were had, and that's what's driven up the homicide rates in these states that have enacted these laws? But we just don't really have the data to be able to do that. I think there's two things in your question. One is gun carrying, and one is gun ownership, and they're two slightly different things as well, which makes it difficult. We really don't have any good data that I know of about gun carrying, at least on a level that is, runs across states and would allow us to get a national picture. Maybe there's some kind of public, there might be some opinion surveys about gun carrying, but you wouldn't be able to disaggregate those by state, potentially. In ownership, people tend to look at that using background checks, but again, it's not very, it's difficult for us to incorporate that into our analysis. But yeah, it's a hard one. It's a hard one to get at. I think one of the things that we do try and incorporate in our work, which might get at the ownership issue, is this use of negative control outcomes, which I mentioned briefly in the presentation. The idea of those outcomes is that they're not supposed to be impacted, or hypothetically not impacted by the intervention that we're interested in, but might help us detect any kind of macro level trend or changes that are ongoing, which might confound the effects that we've found. And I think suicide is often used sometimes as a proxy to look at changes in gun ownership. And we looked at suicide and firearms suicide, at the effects of standard ground laws on those two outcomes. We didn't find any effects at all. And I guess if it was the case that ownership had dramatically changed at the same time that these standard ground laws had come in, we would possibly expect to see changes in suicide, which are caused by the greater availability of guns, or the greater accessibility of guns. And we don't see that, so kind of it's something of a loose control against that being the case. But that said, it does lead to the question about, well, what's driving a law that's quite a way upstream of acts of homicide to cause changes in the patterns. And I think that's a question that we can't get to with the data that we have and the types of analysis that we've done, but hope to look at in the future.
Great, thank you, David. My next question is a broader question. Is there any optimism that the prevalence of firearms and associated homicides in the USA can ever be reduced? Anybody want to have a go at that?
Well, okay, on the homicides part of it, so one of the things that I had emphasized was that, for much of the past 3 decades, we had declining homicide and violence rates in the United States. Last year, kind of the heart of the pandemic, there was a spike in violence, and I think that has a lot of criminologists and a lot of police officers and police leaders, thinking about why that occurred. Why, after all these years, did we see a pretty massive spike in homicide? But it's, there's a lot of things that are anomalous about the pandemic, obviously. But but we have seen, that violence and homicide has declined. It hasn't been even. Some cities, I think New York is an example where homicide has declined quite dramatically over time, less so in Chicago. And so, despite the fact that there's a lot of guns, homicide declined. Now, certainly, I think the evidence suggests that an increase in an increase in guns is not the reason that homicides declined. It's not more guns, less homicide. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. So anyway, the point being that progress was made on homicide, despite the fact that there is most certainly a gun culture in the United States, and there's lots of different reasons for that crime decline, and we can certainly talk about some of that if the audience wants us to. In terms of what's going on with guns in the United States, there's a huge increase in gun purchasing in the United States during the pandemic. Related to I guess one of the previous questions, it's important to think about, even if people are buying guns, whether the people that are buying them are usually just people that already have lots of them. And I think what we've seen during the pandemic was it's a bit of mix. I mean, some people, freaked out about what's going on. I mean, rightfully so, about what's going on with the pandemic and the uncertainty of the last couple of years, have gone out and bought a gun for the very first time. But certainly a lot of the gun purchases that have occurred over the past, 18 to 24 months have been people just, adding to their existing stock of guns. Whether there's any hope of gun control or reducing the number of guns in the United States, I'm pretty cynical on that. Maybe my colleagues want to weigh in with some optimism, but the U.S. Supreme Court is has a big role in this, and they're considering a pretty important gun case from New York this term. So it certainly politics and the justice, the top of the justice system will have a role in deciding what's going on with guns in the United States for the foreseeable future. Well, let me turn it over to my colleagues to weigh in on this important question. Unmute if you can. Or just type quickly in the chat, Dave. Looks like, Steve, you muted yourself rather than unmute. There we go.
You can hear me. Okay, good. I might have lost what I was going to say, but I think, like Dave, yeah, not particularly optimistic, and it's an interesting perspective to come at this from, being a non-native kind of a Brit working in this space where we have gun control and have had for some time, and then spending lots of time in the US speaking to people who adamantly don't want gun control. So I think that's quite interesting to me. That, I mean, this just seems to be huge public support for people to have guns, and I don't know where there's going to be any change in that's going to be powerful enough to move the needle on this in at least the short to medium term future. I was talking to a PhD student of mine the other day, and we were just trying to think about a thought experiment about what it might take for there to be a response to gun control, or kind of public exception that gun control is wanted. Like, for instance, there was in terms of in the UK in response to Dunblane, for instance, or there has been in other parts of Europe in response to other things. And you just don't see that response in the US. And there are enough examples of those kind of atrocities happening, whether that's school shootings, as we've just had one in Michigan, and people are undeterred by that. So it's quite difficult to think about what the motivation that could change people's minds on this would be enough to support action on this. So yeah, that underlines my lack of optimism, I think.
All right, maybe we need to moderate ourselves, Steve.
I can. I mean, I think the next question, I could address it anyway, so I can moderate and address the question and answer the question right away, right?
Yeah.
So there was someone who asked you, what are your hypotheses on why the consensus level of legal cynicism is so important as a moderator? And I'm happy to address that. So the short answer is, I still don't know. This is an ongoing project. We have many hypotheses of what's going on, but we still don't have a definite answer for that. On the one hand, this could be just a confounder for different things. So maybe neighborhoods that are more homogeneous in terms of legal cynicism, that have more consensus and a high score of legal cynicism, so low variation and high average. Maybe those are neighborhoods that also have high levels of structural disadvantage. They're socioeconomically disadvantaged. They have historically been mistreated by the police and so on. So maybe what we're capturing as a consensual level of legal cynicism may not actually be the effect of the consensus level, may just be confounded by other characteristics. We have some interesting control variables, so this could very much not be the case, but we're still investigating. On the other hand, there could actually be an effect of the level of consensus itself. It could play the role of a moderator. And I think the reason would be in the sense of neighborhoods that have a lower level of consensus, so more heterogeneous neighborhoods where people do not agree with each other. There might be a high or a low average score of legal cynicism, but it's all over the place. People have different views and so on. It could be the case that police officers acting in those neighborhoods in a different way, because within those neighborhoods, there are people that feel like the police are there to protect them, and other people within the same neighborhoods who feel like the police are there not to protect them, but maybe to protect the others against themselves. And maybe that's the perception the police officers have as well. So in those neighborhoods, they do not act as aggressively because half of the neighborhood they're meant to protect, half of the neighborhood maybe not so much. Whereas in the neighborhoods where everyone is homogeneously where everyone has consensually cynic views of the law and the police, maybe that's not much the case. Maybe police officers feel, maybe everyone feels like the police are not there to protect them, and maybe that's also how police officers act and believe to be the case. So this could be an explanation. So basically, this is my long way of saying we still don't know. We're investigating. There are many competing hypotheses for this. I'll talk more about that because I think the next question is very much related to that. But there's also the fact that we're still investigating the direction of things. We're still investigating the direction of the relationship between police use of force and legal cynicism. So if Steve excuses me, I'm going to be the moderator again here and read the next question because I started answering that already. But basically, I think the same person actually asked, do you think the individual level longitudinal data and exposure to use of force predicting legal cynicism can serve as a base for claiming the direction of the relationship is use of force leads to cynicism and not the other way around? I think that's precisely the goal of our research here. We're investigating that, and it could very well be a case of reciprocal relationship. Maybe not reciprocal causation, because that's really difficult to disentangle. Maybe the relationships are reciprocal because they're playing at different levels. There's the individual level and the neighborhood level and the interaction between the two. But I think it is very reasonable to believe that, as we showed, long-term exposure to police use of force leads to cynicism. So we have lots of research suggesting that, and our research adds on to that with a temporal component, looking at a really long period to address that. But I think that makes a lot of sense. But it also makes sense that police officers tend to use the force more often in neighborhoods where people are generally cynic at them. They have cynic views of the law and the police, and it could well be the case that one reproduces the other. And this is partly what we're trying to investigate here. I don't know if Dave wants to weigh in on that.
I guess the only thing I would add is, it's, we're talking about a subject matter, police community relations, that is highly charged. People oftentimes have very strong feelings. And so even within the, one of the reasons why, Thiago emphasized this kind of heterogeneity measure we have with respect to the legal cynicism is, the assumption that, there's going to be plenty of Chicago neighborhoods where there are some individuals with some extremely negative views of the police that are very likely counterbalanced by, plenty of residents that that has some very positive views of the police, and that's a much different type of neighborhood than a neighborhood where everybody's like, whatever, I don't have much interaction, I don't really care, and so they may end up having kind of similar average levels of cynicism, but fundamentally different heterogeneities in cynicism, and that that may relate to what happens in an interaction with a police officer. So, for example, if people are uniformly cynical in a neighborhood, and and so then a police officer may come to realize that when they go in that neighborhood, each and every interaction is bound to be very tense. That's a much much different policing nature of police activity than in a neighborhood where you still may have some pretty high average levels of cynicism, but there's some people that are on the side of police and have some pretty favorable views. And so it I think it's one of the things that Thiago and I will think about as we we get further into this research, is we'll continue to think about the fact that understanding the relationship between the police and community, it's a dynamic relationship. It's two-sided. How one side acts influences the other, and that quite frankly, that presents some thorny methodological challenges that we need to sort through. But to answer the I guess the second question from the individual, I wouldn't be surprised if there is kind of this reciprocal relationship, that both cynicism and use of force, they kind of, as Thiago said, they reproduce each other.
Thank you, David. That brings an end to the questions that we have. And, listening to the talks myself, I think it's a fascinating area when we kind of looking at, exposure to police use of force, protectionism, and understand your ground position, particularly in the context where there's calls to defund the police. There's maybe challenges in terms of the morale in police morale, in terms of more criticism that they're facing, and kind of looking ahead to reforms to try and improve police legitimacy going forward, and whether there needs to be dramatic change. So I think that's been a really useful 3 papers, not just in terms of its subject matter and its contemporary relationship to how policing is done, but also the methodological approaches employed. I think that's been a really useful insight. So on behalf of UCL and Christchurch, thank you all 4 of you for presenting these really interesting papers and giving such a good account of your research. And we'll call at the end of the seminar there. So many thanks to all of you.
Thanks very much.
Paul, could you stop the recording, please? Just